What would happen if Trump were to transform the US into a dictatorship? The United States of America has long been the epitome of democracy and freedom in the modern world. The country's political system, based on the Constitution and its system of checks and balances, was designed to prevent any one individual or party from seizing too much power. However, in recent years, we've seen growing distrust in institutions, increased polarization, and moves to concentrate power in the hands of one leader. The idea of a US dictatorship, while far-fetched to some, has been discussed more frequently in political discourse. This essay explores the implications of former President Donald Trump turning the United States into a dictatorship, examining how it could happen, the likely consequences, and what such a transition would mean for the country and the world. Section 1: How could Trump turn the US into a dictatorship? A dictatorship is defined as a form of government where one individual or group holds absolute power, typically attained through undemocratic means. In a democratic country like the US, such a transition would require a complete breakdown of democratic norms and institutions. Here's how Trump, or any leader in his position, could potentially pave the way for authoritarian rule, erosion of democratic norms. One of the first steps in the transition to dictatorship is the gradual erosion of democratic norms. A leader who continuously undermines democratic processes, such as elections, checks on executive power, and free speech, creates an environment where the public becomes desensitized to authoritarian actions. Trump has already demonstrated this tactic, particularly by casting doubt on the legitimacy of elections, claiming widespread voter fraud without evidence, and undermining trust in institutions like the judiciary, the media, and intelligence agencies. Manipulating or abolishing elections. If Trump were to continue down the path of undermining election integrity, he could pursue drastic measures to manipulate or even abolish the election process entirely. This could take the form of legal challenges to elections, rejecting results that don't favor him, or installing loyalists to key election-related positions. In a worst-case scenario, Trump could invoke national emergency powers, citing a fabricated threat to national security, to cancel or indefinitely delay elections, justifying the continuation of his presidency without a mandate from the people. Consolidating power. A crucial element of any dictatorship is the concentration of power in the hands of one individual or a small group of loyalists. To do this, Trump would likely attempt to stack key government institutions with his allies. This would include nominating judges who align with his political views, purging government agencies of dissenting voices, and exerting control over military and law enforcement. The executive branch could become even more centralized, as agencies like the FBI, CIA, and Department of Justice are politicized, making it harder for checks and balances to function. Silencing dissent. Dictators often target opposition movements, including the press, opposition political parties, and activists. Trump could take steps to weaken the media's role as a watchdog by labeling critical outlets as fake news and using legal threats, propaganda, or government-backed entities to suppress alternative voices. Political opponents might be jailed, harassed, or otherwise eliminated from the political discourse. Meanwhile, his supporters would likely rally behind him, rationalizing any actions as necessary to preserve the nation. Section 2. The domestic impact of a Trump dictatorship. The end of elections and civil liberties. In a dictatorship, regular elections would either become a thing of the past or be entirely controlled by the leader. Trump could seek to abolish term limits for the presidency, allowing him to remain in office indefinitely. Voting rights would likely be suppressed, especially in traditionally democratic areas. Voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and other tactics could be used to tilt the electoral system in favor of the ruling party. The suppression of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to protest, would likely follow. Militarization of law enforcement. In a dictatorship, the role of the military and law enforcement changes from protecting the public to enforcing the leader's will. Trump could likely use the military to quash protests or dissent, much like authoritarian leaders in history. He could militarize police forces, allowing them to crack down on protests and dissent with impunity. Government agencies might be co-opted to spy on opposition groups or monitor citizens' communications, effectively making surveillance a tool for control. Nationalism and the suppression of minority groups. A Trump-led dictatorship would likely use nationalism as a rallying cry to consolidate power. By fostering fear of outsiders and portraying the US as under siege by foreign enemies or domestic threats, Trump could justify authoritarian actions in the name of national security. Minority groups, immigrants, people of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, could face increased discrimination and suppression, as populist rhetoric often targets marginalized communities in the pursuit of unity through fear. Control over the economy. While the US economy is market-driven, a dictatorship under Trump might increasingly turn to corporatism or state-controlled industries that align with the leader's interests. Corporate giants that support Trump's agenda would likely thrive, while those who oppose him might face punitive measures. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few could widen the economic divide, making the rich richer and the poor more vulnerable. Section 3, Global Consequences and the Role of the International Community. The end of American leadership. As a global superpower, the United States has long been seen as a champion of democracy. If Trump were to transform the US into a dictatorship, it would dramatically alter global geopolitics. Allies such as Canada and European countries might distance themselves from the US, while authoritarian regimes, like Russia and China, could benefit from the shift. With the US becoming an isolated pariah state, there would be a power vacuum on the global stage, with authoritarianism gaining ground while democratic movements face new challenges. Economic fallout and sanctions. If the US transitioned into a dictatorship, the global community would likely impose sanctions on the country, further isolating it. These sanctions would cripple the economy, leading to inflation, unemployment, and a decline in living standards for the average American. Major trading partners might sever ties, making it harder for US businesses to thrive in the international market. The fate of US military alliances. America's role as a global military power has been a cornerstone of its influence. But if the US were under dictatorial rule, NATO and other military alliances would face an existential crisis. Nations that once relied on American support may turn to other powers, including China and Russia, to secure their own national interests. This would diminish America's influence over global security and weaken its ability to project power overseas. In conclusion, a transition from democracy to dictatorship in the United States is not a far-off fantasy, but a very real risk in times of crisis or extreme political instability. While Trump's actions during his presidency raised concerns about his respect for democratic norms, it's important to consider the broader implications of a transition to authoritarian rule. Such a shift would not only impact the lives of millions of Americans but would reverberate across the globe, changing the balance of power and shaping the future of global governance. The question remains, would Americans resist such a transformation, or would they let it happen in the name of stability and security? History shows that no democracy is guaranteed, and the US must remain vigilant in protecting its democratic ideals.